Mr Speaker.
Clare Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in the second reading of the Broadcasting Election Programmes and Election Advertising Amendment Bill / Electoral Amendment Bill cognated, which is, as the Minister has said, a cognated bill. Mr Speaker, Labor supports this bill. We commend the committee for the work that's been done. Commend also the Minister for her efforts in reforming and modernising various pieces of legislation over the last few years. Please, with a small plea, please can the Privacy Act be next in terms of introducing mandatory reporting for privacy breaches and providing more teeth to the Privacy Commissioner. With regards to these bills, these two bills follow a fairly substantial piece of work following the last general election in 2014, a report of the Justice and Electoral Committee, of which there were 28 recommendations, and so that committee did do a substantial piece of work. These two bills include 12 of those recommendations in the second part of this cognate bill. The substance, with regards to the first bill, the Broadcasting Election Programmes and Election Advertising Amendment Bill, this, as the Minister said, it modernises and updates the format of election broadcasts in time for the 2017 election this year. It removes the requirement for the political parties opening and closing election broadcasts, which are seen, and I think there's fairly substantial evidence for them being an anachronism in today's world. And it also removes the requirement for TVNZ and Radio New Zealand to provide free time for those broadcasts. Instead, this bill allocates the equivalent of this time into an increase in the broadcast funding allocation. For the large part of the New Zealand population, those television opening and closing statements are outdated. People's viewing habits are changing. Fewer people are watching those set-piece broadcasts. And this bill increases the flexibility that political parties have to use their allocation for election programs. I just want to reference the submission to the inquiry that the Select Committee conducted by the Labor Party, which went into some depth about the limitations of the existing regime, which results in increasingly inefficient use of public funds by all parties. And this isn't just relating to the Labor Party, this basically relates to the inefficiency generally of the system, which is why we're changing it. And it noted that media consumption habits and marketing tools have changed hugely over the past 10 years. The public no longer embrace and consume generic marketing messages. New Zealanders expect interactivity and personal relevance from all brands that they choose to engage with, including political parties. And while this is true of younger voters, the changes are really being viewed across all demographics, and I think that's probably pretty evident by the rise of Facebook and the demographics that are using that. The broadcasting allocation rules restrict the budget to the purchase of media and production costs for TV, radio and press only. And these channels, although relevant and able to provide reasonable reach, provide decreasing cut-through as the public use tools such as MySky, video on demand, to filter out broadcast adverts. So essentially, this is sensible, and it actually is going to enable there to be a much greater reach, ability, flexibility for there to be communication and engagement during our important three-yearly event, which is an election campaign, which is when we engage with voters and is a really important part of what we do. Of course we do, but this is the prescribed funded part of that process, and it's important that we get it right and that we're up with the times. The electoral amendment bill part of this cognated bill implements, as I said, the unanimous Select Committee report recommendations from the Justice and Electoral Inquiry into the 2014 election. It implements 12 of those 28 recommendations. The Select Committee stated that only those changes which could be realistically implemented in time for the September 2017 election would be included. The government has suggested or indicated that they will consider some other recommendations that require, as they said, more time for 2020. I want to touch on this, Mr. Speaker, because there are some particular issues around those recommendations that have been included, which are a bit disappointing in the sense that they have disenfranchised the thousands of voters who have not completed the enrolment activity that they could have done before the election. And while there is some capacity there for them to have their votes counted, there's also that disenfranchising that means that many of them are unlikely to, and that really does matter. And if this government is really serious about the recommendations that are included in this report, then these really should have been taken more seriously and given a higher weighting, a higher priority. In the last election, Mr. Speaker, almost 10% of the population who were eligible to be on the electoral roll didn't sign up before election day. Numbers suggest that the failure to enrol does not always mean that a voter doesn't want to participate. For the 2014 election, more than 27,000 voters made the effort to vote but had their vote disallowed because they were not on the electoral roll. Now, that's the population of a town, and that matters, and that should be something that is taken really very seriously and shouldn't be pushed out to 2020. It should have been addressed now. I'm looking forward to asking some questions about that at the committee stage, because we don't make the process of enrolling and voting as easy as we could, especially for those who change address and therefore fail to enrol, or those who are enrolling for the first time before the official roll is printed. So we have some concerns about that, Mr. Speaker. The integrity of the voting system has been well maintained with the significant increase in early voting, and we don't accept that the risk outweighs the benefit of ensuring that next time possibly 27,000 votes will be counted. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make a couple of remarks about the fact that one of these cognate bills is a broadcasting bill, makes changes to the Broadcasting Act, Section 6 of the Broadcasting Act, yet in the recent reshuffle just before Christmas, the new unelected Prime Minister disestablished the broadcasting ministership portfolio, and that has gone floating into the ether. He hasn't been elected by the voters, which is the bills that we're actually that we're discussing. Mr. Speaker, this broadcasting portfolio has been disestablished. It's been divided between communications on the one hand, arts, culture and heritage on the other. During the 1990s, this portfolio under a national government was folded into the communications portfolio, which is one of the first things Labor did in 1999 when it became government, was to separate it out and give it the status that it needed. This is a really worrying development. There is no indication as to how those functions are actually going to be performed under this government.